Please be seated. So, do you ever feel like we're not getting the whole story? I thought I understood this parable. It's one of those ones that we just love. We love to point to it when we're talking about sharing the treasure and talents that we have been given by God. But you know what? I must have always skipped this bit because this just does not sound like the sort of thing that we expect Jesus to say, does it? Well, before we try to figure out what we're missing about this perplexing parable, I want to step back and look at our truly incomplete story for the morning, the story of Deborah. Today's reading cuts out right before the action begins, and it leaves us wondering, what happened? Did they win? It's sort of like, remember when we used to get to go to movie theaters, and there would be a movie reel, and it would break. We'd get that sound, whoa, and then the entire audience would be like, no! Well, I was hoping that we'd get the ending to Deborah's saga next week. But I looked, and we moved straight on to Ezekiel. So you know what? I'm not spoiling anything for anyone if I take a moment today to go ahead and tell us all the rest of the story. The story of Deborah is from the book of Judges. In fact, it's the only story from the book of Judges that we get in the entirety of the 3-year lectionary cycle. The time of Judges is a sort of in-between time. The people, with God's help, had escaped slavery in Egypt. They'd survived 40 years in the wilderness, and they'd made it to their new home in Canaan. It's pretty exciting stuff, and you kind of feel like you get to the end and you want to say, salvation accomplished, and just tick it off the list. They just needed to settle down to living in covenant with God, right? Only, you know what? We're talking about human beings here in a human world. They got distracted by all the wealth and the resources, the fertile fields, the flocks, their tents overflowing with offspring. They never really figured out how to get along with the people that were already living in the land of Canaan. Sound familiar? Well, what happens is over and over again, generation after generation, they forget about that covenant with God, and they find themselves in a huge mess. It's only when they reach that point that they just reach out and they say, help us, God. God sends them a new leader called a judge to help sort out whatever pickle that they found themselves in. Together with the judge, they figure it out. They manage peace and prosperity for about another generation or so until, you know what? They mess it up all over again, and a new judge is needed. That's pretty much the whole of the book of Judges, but it is worth a read. Well, as you can see from the beginning of our reading today, things were pretty messed up in Deborah's time. For 20 years, the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali in the north were cruelly oppressed by the Canaanite king Jabin. Now, what I find really amazing about Deborah is that she could have just ignored that whole situation. Her central power was not in the north. She was from further south, well out of the zone of Jabin's control. And she was a respected leader in her own right already. Now, to say that it was risky for Deborah to step into the situation and to call upon Barak to muster the 2 northern tribes is an understatement. 10,000 infantrymen may sound like a lot, but it is nothing against an army of 900 chariots of iron. They could have been completely slaughtered. But you know what? She is Deborah, Eshet HaLaphido, meaning not only wife of Laphido, but also meaning woman on fire. Deborah is not willing to take the easy road when others are suffering under oppression. She trusts her understanding of Yahweh as the God who saves, and she risks acting on this faith. It's what Walter Brueggemann would call daring discipleship. So, you want to know what happens? Deborah goes out and she tells Barak to amass his 10,000 troops on the high ground of Mount Tabor. Now, down in the valley below, King Jabin's general Sisek moves against them by marching his 900 chariots right up a dry riverbed of the Kishon. All of a sudden, God throws Sisek's armies into a panic when the waters of that river rise up and sweep down to engulf them. Sounds pretty dramatic, but if you've ever seen a riverbed rise from nothing in the desert, all of a sudden in a rainstorm, you know that it is not at all far-fetched. And of course, you know what happens to chariots in mud? They get stuck. It leaves all of those armies up here for Barak with nothing to do because, of course, they're infantrymen, they're on feet, they can just sweep down, and that's the end of the story. They finish them off. There is a lot more in this story, so I do recommend that you look it up. But you know what spoke to me today was the fact that being participants in God's work of liberation takes courage and risk. It takes the courage to know the God who saves and the faith to act upon that knowledge. Now, clearly God had others he could and did work through in this story. But Deborah's daring discipleship of courage and faith, it stands out. She really understood what God is about in this world. And you know what? It's more than just sitting safely under a palm tree and negotiating disputes, though that work of peacemaking is important too. Right now, I am in the middle of doing a training in asset-based community development, known as ABCD for short. ABCD is designed to help congregations who want to be more daring in their discipleship. It teaches us how to do that risky, hard work of listening and getting to know our neighbors, especially the most vulnerable ones. It's all about building relationships and working together to meet the needs of our wider community. Now, I know that we all long for a place and a time where it's safe for us to just worship together in this one building on Sunday mornings. But you know what? I have also heard how you all want us to get better at reaching beyond our walls also. I read it in the parish profile before I ever even met you. I heard it from the search committee and I've heard it from the vestry. And you know what? I also heard it from many of you as you told me about your hopes and dreams for St. Philip's in our Meet the Priest conversations. The other thing that I've noticed is that St. Philip's actually knows a lot more about this already than I do, because you were a church plant not all that long ago. It's still right there in your DNA. I've heard the stories about the early days when you phoned all of Scotts Valley and sent teams out to knock on doors. That took great courage and incredible faith. And you know what? Here you all are today, the fruit of that risky discipleship. So phone campaigns, knocking on doors, those were the ways of the late 1980s. A lot has changed, hasn't it? This is a different time, and it is a strange one at that. We have so much more technology, and yet we can't even gather face to face with each other, much less with all of the people around us in our wider community. It will take new skills, discernment, prayer, and a great deal of creativity to figure out exactly how God is calling us to meet the emerging needs in our wider community in 2021. We've already been transformed by this year and all of the ways that our ministries have had to adapt and respond to virus and fire. But we also know that there is a great deal more need out there in our community, both physical and spiritual needs. It's actually quite daunting to consider, much less to figure out how to respond. I think this takes us back to that perplexing parable of the talents. Now, we usually say this parable is about being good stewards of our own God-given talents. But you know what? At the time of the parable, a talent was just a coin, just a piece of money. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages that it took on this secondary association. And that word talent, well, it actually came into our English language only after the meaning of parable changed. It would actually be a lot easier to just keep reading it that way and stopping right there. But then we would have to sort of just shove aside all that really troubling stuff from the end of the reading. To really figure out what this parable is saying to us, we have to delve into what was going on in the community to whom Matthew wrote his gospel. Matthew wrote for a small group of Jewish Christians at a time when Judaism was full of all sorts of competing ideas about the coming Messiah and how this could be explained, how this could help explain what was happening to them under Roman occupation. Now, Matthew's community's answer to this question was, of course, Jesus was the Messiah. He's already come and he will return again. It was his own life, death, and resurrection that was God's new saving act for all of us. Now, it's hard to imagine, but this was not a popular opinion in wider Jewish culture at the time. It was tough to be a part of this little sect waiting for Jesus's return. You can see then why Matthew has chosen to include this particular story from the Jesus tradition about a master who goes away for a time and leaves his servants in charge of a very great treasure. And you know what? This is a huge treasure. One talent alone was worth an entire year's worth of wages. 8 talents is just like an astronomical amount of money. So if what Matthew was really interested in is what his community of Christians does with itself while it's waiting for Jesus's return, then the treasure must be something that Jesus left for them. Now, Jesus taught them a lot. Jesus taught them how to know God as a loving Father, how to receive and respond to the gift of this all-accepting love from God, how to build a community that welcomes the outcast, how it's God's plan to rebuild this world to be like his heavenly kingdom of love and peace. Matthew's community was not given money. They weren't talking about being given gifts or talents that they have innately inside them, so much as a gift of grace and a gospel of radical love and hope in God. You can see now why in this context, the parable is an obvious choice. Matthew's readers could choose to hide out and just wait around for Jesus's return. They could do church as they gathered on the quiet in each other's homes. But you know what? Would they be the church? And would there be a church today if that had been their choice? Of course, that would have been the safe choice given the political and social climate for Matthew's readers. But that would also miss the whole point of radical love and hope in God. It would be like burying the gospel in the ground. It actually took incredibly daring discipleship for them to risk sharing how Jesus taught them to love God and each other without fear, how he showed us this by dying and rising again, and how this has changed our relationship with God and with each other forever. You know what? Thanks be to God that some of the early Christians made this daring choice of discipleship. The treasure of the gospel of love has grown and grown and grown. I think Matthew must have felt like his audience wasn't quite that courageous yet, and they needed a little push, and that's why he wrote this parable. You wonder what was stopping them? It was just fear. It's just like that servant who missed the incredible generosity of his master and totally misinterpreted his master's intentions. It's just like those ancient Israelites who kept forgetting that God is the God who saves. Over and over, fear, it just gets inside of us and it warps our understanding of our relationship with God and our relationships with each other. Matthew does not want this to happen to his readers. He doesn't want his community to just sit there and become more and more narrow and frightened. It would eventually make them fear God as well as their neighbors, just like that third slave who created that fearful image of his master and hid his treasure in the ground. They would have missed the abundance of sharing God's grace. It would be almost like not having received that grace at all. So, if that enormous treasure is the gospel, if it's the promise of a God who offers a relationship of love and connection to us all as a way of being with God and each other, then it is going to leave us bereft if we're too afraid to risk sharing this kind of love in our lives and in the world. That is exactly what daring discipleship is. The courage to trust our faith that God's will is always to save, and then to keep acting on this faith. Matthew's little community of believers lived in a strange time, just like we do. They had valid fears of persecution, yet you know what? They figured out how to risk sharing this good news in that climate. We too have to find the courage to figure out how we can be in greater and wider and deeper relationship with our neighbors in ways that can still protect us both from spreading this virus. It's not going to be easy, but it is our calling. You know what? Remember how we thought the hardest thing we would have to do is to figure out how to get everyone onto Zoom? Well, there's more, and we will figure it out with God's help. I pray that we, the people of St. Philip's in 2021, will continue to allow the Holy Spirit to stretch us and to shape us as we discover how God calls us to be daring disciples right here in Scotts Valley, meeting our neighbors in new ways, confronting oppression together, and sharing in the wealth of God's reconciliation and peace. Amen.